The evening Liam Dagda died, the sea forgot how to breathe. Turtle Bay usually sang at dusk, rigging clinking, vendors shouting over one another, gulls wheeling and shrieking above the ships. Nexu lamps, pale blue and steady, flickered to life along the harbor road, fed by the mana wells beneath the cobbles. But that night, as clouds rolled in from the eastern sea and swallowed the stars, the city went quiet. Darin had never heard it so quiet. He crouched on the slate roof of his family's cramped tenement over Old Fish Market Street, knees tucked to his chest, watching the lanterns along the main avenue below. Rain threatened, but never quite fell, hanging in the air like held breath. The wind from the water was cold enough to bite through his threadbare coat. "They'll say something tonight," his older sister Raina murmured beside him. "They have to." She always said things like that, like the world would eventually remember to be fair. Darin snorted and hugged himself tighter. "They'll raise prices on lamp oil again. That's what they'll say." "Be serious," she nudged his shoulder with hers. "The Nexu Council sent 2 sages here. You saw the banners on their ship. They don't do that for nothing." "I saw the banners," he said. "I also saw the Kolap crest on half the barracks." "Guess which one has more soldiers?" Raina fell quiet at that, her dark eyes flicking to the distant hill where the old Dagda manor loomed over the bay, its windows lit like watchful eyes. Somewhere inside, they said, Liam Dagda was meeting with the council envoys, discussing taxes and troops and the rising piracy along the coast. Darin didn't care about any of that. He cared that their landlord had doubled the rent. He cared that his father came home from the docks with bloody knuckles more often than with wages. He cared that the market's tribute tax, paid by every farming village and fishing hamlet sending goods into Turtle Bay, had made fish more expensive than bread. Magic and politics were for nobles with colored blood. Darin's blood was the ordinary red of a boy who ran messages for coin and stole apples when no one watched. Below, the streets thinned further as curfew neared. Lanterns were doused, shutters closed. Only the city guard and a few late-working dock crews moved beneath the looming warehouses. Raina suddenly caught her breath and pointed. "There, look." A small group emerged from the direction of Dagda Manor, cloaks drawn up against the biting wind. In the lead walked a tall man in a deep blue coat, the fabric trimmed in silver. Even from this distance, Darin recognized the way he carried himself. Straight spine, unhurried step, the slight tilt of his head as if he listened to something others could not hear. Liam Dagda, Lord of Turtle Bay. The man whose sigil, a blue banner with a silver tree, flew over the city's main square. He should have been surrounded by guards. He wasn't. Only 3 advisors flanked him, their shoulders hunched, faces pale in the cold lamplight. They spoke in low, urgent tones Darin wished he could hear. Liam's hair bound back at the nape of his neck, whipped in the wind. "He shouldn't be out here," Raina whispered. "Not without the honor guard. Not with the Kolaps." A shape moved on a rooftop across the avenue. Darin's eyes, sharpened from a childhood of watching for dockside brawls and angry merchants, caught the silhouette. Someone crouched in the shadow of a chimney stack. Another perched on the lip of a balcony as the air shifted. "Raina," he said quietly. "We should go inside." "In a minute," she murmured, still watching Dagda. Her breath fogged in the cold. "Maybe he'll..." The first arrow whispered through the air. Darin didn't see it leave the bow. One heartbeat, Liam Dagda walked, cloak billowing behind him. The next, his body jerked, as if the wind itself had punched through his chest. Raina's hand flew to her mouth. The arrowhead burst out the back of his coat in a spray of golden, gold, not red, blood misting the air. Nexu light flickered around the wound, a brief halo of shimmering azure, then vanished. For a heartbeat, the city held its breath with him. Then Liam staggered, fingers clawing uselessly at the shaft, and fell to one knee. Shadows peeled away from the alley's walls as hooded figures poured into the street. Darin had seen plenty of street violence. None of it looked like this. These people moved like blades given legs, efficient, silent, no wasted motion. Nexu sigils glimmered briefly at their wrists and throats. Fire, shadow, steel, nothing showy, everything deadly. "Get down," Darin hissed, dragging Raina flatter against the roof tiles. They watched through a gap between chimneys as the assassins closed in. Liam Dagda drew his dagger. Even wounded, he moved with the unhurried grace of a man who had commanded battlefields. For one wild second, Darin thought he might actually stand. Blades flashed. Steel met flesh in wet, ugly sounds that Darin knew would chase him into his dreams. There was no shouted accusation, no proclamation, no demands, only workmanlike murder, swift and deliberate. They didn't even allow him a dying speech. When it was done, Liam Dagda lay in a spreading pool of gold that shone dully in the lamplight. Rhaena shook under Darin's arm, tears streaming silently down her face. The assassins did not flee. Instead, two of them knelt by the body. One drew a cruel hooked knife. Darin turned his face away. He couldn't block his ears. Later, much later, his memories of that night would blur at the edges. The distant crash of waves, the metallic tang of blood, carried on the wind, the muffled sobs from the room below, as someone, later, shouted the news through the streets. But he would never forget the sight that greeted Turtle Bay with the first light of dawn. He didn't mean to go to the square. His feet simply took him there, carried by the same horrified instinct that moved half the city. He and Rhaena squeezed through the crowd, past weeping mothers and white-faced dockhands, until the flagpole at the heart of Turtle Bay came into view. The Dagda banner was gone. In its place, a new flag snapped in the morning wind, a stark black field slashed by a blood-red spiral. The crest House Kolap adopted after Liam Dagda killed Shane Kolap decades ago. Beneath it, mounted crudely on the pole where the Dagda standard had flown, a severed head stared out over the square, hair dark and matted, eyes filmed and empty, mouth slack. Dried streaks of gold stained the wood below. Someone screamed. Someone else dropped to their knees. A chant tried to start and died in the throat of the man who began it. Rhaena swayed beside Darin. They put him up like a traitor. Darin's stomach churned. Why is his blood gold? He whispered. The question ripped from him. Because he's old blood, she choked. Because the Dagdas are fae-touched, you idiot. Because he was ours. Soldiers in black and red Kolap livery ringed the square, spears lowered. Their commander's voice rang out over the murmurs. By decree of Regent Kolap, he shouted, Turtle Bay is under new protection. Protection. Darin looked at the severed head and felt something hot and sharp wedge itself under his ribs. He thought of their landlord raising the rent, of tribute taxes choking the villages, of his father's split knuckles and his mother's hollow cheeks. He thought of blue blood shining on the flagpole like paint. Rhaena's hand found his and squeezed hard enough to hurt. Remember this, she whispered fiercely. Remember what they did. One day, Darin, one day. The anger in him shivered like a door rattling on its hinges. He didn't know it yet, but the bleak decline began that morning, with a boy staring up at a dead man's head and feeling the first spark of something dangerous kindle in his chest. Not fear, not grief, resolve. 10 years later, the fields of Flagler Coast tasted of ash. Darin stood at the edge of his father's last acre, the dry stalks rasping against one another as the wind pushed through the failing crop. The soil beneath was pale and exhausted, stripped of its strength by years of overwork and relentless tithe. What had once been rich, black earth now powdered between his fingers like dust. 60% they used to take. He remembered the number whispered in every tavern and by every mother at market, the old complaint that had seemed unbearable when he was a child. 60% of grain, of coin, of livestock. Enough to hurt, not enough to kill. Now the collectors took 84. Stop glaring at it, his father muttered, limping up beside him. The land doesn't care what you think. The land cares what they take, Darin said. His father gave a grim, humorless huff. Lines had carved themselves deep into the older man's face, his shoulders permanently bowed from years of work. A badly set leg, broken during unloading at the docks years ago, gave his walk a lopsided rhythm. They've taken all they can, his father said. And then they'll take us. Beyond their little strip, the hills rolled toward the distant shimmer of the sea. Other farms stretched up and down the valley, most of them half abandoned. Fields lay fallow not by choice, but because there was no seed left to plant. Empty houses watched the road with broken windows. A crow perched on a ruined fence post, head cocked as if judging them. Darin wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist. The air was thick with heat and the cloying scent of rot from a mildew-stricken section of wheat. The tithe master comes tomorrow. Aye. His father's mouth tightened. And we'll have nothing left to feed ourselves. You could push back when they took 60%. Bargain, I'd a sack or two. Hope the inspector was lazy. At 84, there was nothing to argue about. They took everything that grew. And then the coins you'd borrowed to feed your family while you were growing it. You should go, his father said quietly. Darin turned. Go where? Flag Harbor, or Turtle Bay, or even Mer Coast. The military still pays, even if it's in copper scraps. They don't pay enough to keep this farm. His father gave him a look, equal parts weary and resigned. This farm is already gone. You just don't want to admit it. A decade had not dulled the memory of Liam Dagda's head on the flagpole. It had, however, buried it under so many smaller indignities that Darin sometimes wondered if that terrible dawn had been a warning. They had all simply refused to heed. The Kolaps now ruled more than Mer Coast. Their reach stretched from Turtle Bay's docks to the inland villages and even Flag Harbor, their emblems stamped on tax ledgers and military orders alike. Bleak decline, that's what traveling scribes called it, in half-drunken stories by the hearth. The slow strangling of Flagler Coast beneath its own greed. 85% of the government's coin now came from agricultural taxes, or so the last broadside claimed. 85% squeezed from earth that could no longer give. We could sign a labor bond, Darin offered, hating himself for saying it. His father flinched. Sell ourselves to some Kolap estate? Not forever, just for a few years. Enough to break our backs in someone else's fields instead of our own? The older man's voice was sharp enough to cut. Then it sagged. If I go, I don't come back. You know that. Old cripples don't buy their way out of service. Darin's throat tightened. He had seen them, on trips into the larger towns. Lines of men and women leaving their ancestral land to work on noble estates, heads bowed, small bundles of possessions slung over their shoulders. The new serfs, they were calling them. Not slaves, not exactly. Not free either. What good was a freedom that came with an empty stomach and an unpaid tithe? I'll go to Flag Harbor, Darin said abruptly, before he could talk himself out of it. Enlist. They're always short of soldiers. Now, you said it yourself. His father eyed him, gaze lingering on the faint, pale mark at his collarbone. It was a swirl of wind that had appeared on Darin's skin after he went through transgenesis and performed his bloodbind 3 years earlier. It was barely more than a birthmark, but in this world such marks meant power, or they were supposed to. Not every bloodbind left an ability mark, so you'll give them your Nexu as well as your life? His father asked. They already take everything else, Darin said. Maybe this time I get something back. The older man grunted. You sound like your mother. Darin's chest ached at the mention. She'd died the winter after the taxes rose, worn thin by hunger and too many births. The tribute collectors had come that same week, demanding their due. His father had handed over their last sacks of grain with shaking hands, while Darin stood behind him and stared at the Kolap crest burned into the lead inspector's breastplate. He saw that same crest everywhere now, stamped on coins, inked onto ledgers, flying from watchtowers. The Kolaps owned the very ink that recorded what people owed. Take the North Road, his father murmured. Stay off the main highway. The bandits are getting bold. A bitter smile. Can't blame them, I suppose. If I had 2 good legs, I might have joined them myself. I'll send money, Darin said. His father gripped his shoulder. Send hope, if you can find any. Coin spends fast. Hope lasts longer. The Nexu in Darin's chest stirred again as his father's rough palm pressed over the faint wind mark. For a moment, a breeze slipped through the dead field, cool, almost gentle, stirring the dry stalks. You feel that? His father asked softly. Darin nodded. Sometimes, when I'm angry, good. His father's gaze was far away now, fixed on something beyond the tired hills. Hold on to that anger. Don't let it eat you, but don't let it die either. Men like Kolap count on our feelings going numb, on us getting too tired to care. Darin swallowed. And if I don't come back, his father's hand tightened once more, then dropped. Then you make sure it meant something that you left. The next morning, with a threadbare pack and a loaf of stale bread, Darin walked away from the farm. away from the grave where they'd laid his mother, away from the fields that no longer belonged to them. As he crested the first low hill, he looked back. His father stood at the edge of the field, a lone figure against the dying crop, hand raised in a stiff, stubborn salute. Darin raised his in return, fingers shaking. Then he turned toward Flag Harbor, toward the Celtic Legion's recruitment halls, and toward whatever waited for him in the shadow of the Kolap banners. The wind at his back felt like a promise. Flag Harbor hit him first in the nose. The stench of tar, fish guts, and old smoke clung to the harbor district like a curse. Ships with patched sails and tired hulls creaked at anchor, their crews shouting over one another in a dozen dialects. Nets hung from poles like flayed skin. Beyond the docks, the city rose in layers, warehouses stacked like stone teeth, then tiers of slate rooftops and crooked chimneys, and higher still the citadel, its spires stabbing the sky. Kolap banners flew from every tower, red spirals on black snapping in the salt wind. Darin tugged his coat tighter and followed the road inland, boots slipping on damp cobblestones. His pack felt too light. He owned everything he carried. The recruitment hall squatted between a moneylender's office and a bakery whose window was half empty. Once Darin had heard queues stretched down the street and around the corner, boys and men eager to join the Celtics, to earn steady coin and a meal a day. Now, the wide stone steps were almost bare. A single young man sat on the bottom step, turning a copper drachma over in his fingers with the air of someone trying to decide if it was worth it. Two older veterans leaned against the wall, uniforms faded, armor dented. "Enlisting?" one veteran called as Darin climbed. "If they'll have me," Darin said. "If you've got two hands and enough teeth left to bite, they'll have you," the man replied. "Question is whether you'll still have either after a year." The recruitment hall's heavy doors were open to the dusty interior. Inside, rows of benches stretched toward a raised platform, where an officer in black and red sat behind a scarred desk. He wore no helmet, only a thin circlet with the Kolap crest on his brow. He looked tired. "Name?" the officer asked as Darin approached. "Darin, son of Bray, from North Valley. Age? 22. Wear badger. Wear beast I see." The officer studied him. "You have Nexu?" "A little. Show me." Darin swallowed and lifted his hand, palm up. He breathed in, picturing the wind that used to whistle over the valley and sift through tired wheat. The faint mark at his collarbone tingled. Air stirred above his palm, a small swirling thread of breeze that gathered dust motes and lifted them in a lazy spiral. Not much, nothing dramatic. The officer's eyes sharpened. Element? Wind. He hesitated. "I'm not trained. Most aren't anymore," the officer muttered under his breath, jotting something down. "Nexus type? I don't..." The officer waved a hand. "Doesn't matter. The Nexu Council sends lecturers once a year, and the men sleep through the lessons." He peered at Darin again. "You look like you can march. You own armor?" Darin shook his head. "Good," the man said dryly. "You won't have to watch it rust. Sign here." He pushed a parchment forward. Darin's fingers trembled slightly as he took the quill. The ink smelled sharp. He scratched his name, each letter another stitch binding him to the country that had bled his family dry. "Congratulations," the officer said. "You now belong to the 3rd Coastal Legion. Report to Barracks Row 5. Ask for Centurion Moros. Pay is monthly, if there is any. If there is..." Darin repeated. The officer's mouth curled in a humorless smile. "Welcome to the rest of your life, recruit. Life in the 3rd Legion was not what the old stories promised." The barracks were overcrowded and under-repaired, with leaking roofs and mold in the corners. The armory shelves were half empty. Darin's issued cuirass had a crack near the right shoulder. He wrapped it in leather strips scavenged from a discarded belt to keep it from collapsing. "Used to be," grumbled Talon. The veteran assigned to show him around, a Celtic's armor shone so bright you could see your reflection. "Now they're lucky if it doesn't fall off in the rain." They drilled in mismatched ranks on a practice field whose boundary markers had rotted away. Darin learned the basics of spear, shield, and short sword, his muscles burning with the unfamiliar strain. He learned to fall asleep in a row of snoring bodies, to ignore the constant itch of flea bites, to choke down thin stew thickened with more water than meat. He learned, too, to feel his Nexu. Again barked the Nexu instructor. a narrow-faced woman with storm-gray eyes. She wore no house crest, only the neutral sigil of the Nexu Council stitched at her collar. Darin stood in a rough row with half a dozen recruits who could coax at least a flicker of power from their chakras. Sweat trickled down his back. The practice yard's dust rose in slow puffs around their boots. "Your element is wind," she said, circling him. "Your nexus, Her gaze narrowed, unfocused in the way of those feeling rather than seeing. Range, maybe, or manipulation. Hard to tell. You've had no real training. No, Darin admitted. Flagler Coast used to send its gifted to academies, she muttered. Now they send them to shovel manure and armor. She raised her voice. All of you, remember this. Nexu is not a toy. It's not a parlor trick to impress tavern girls. It's a blade, and you are the sheath. If you blunt it with carelessness, it will fail you when you need it most. She stopped in front of him, raising her hand. Breathe. Find your root. Let mana from the land flow up through your chakras. Do not force it. Guide it. Darin inhaled. The memories came unbidden, his father's rough hand on his shoulder, the dead field's brief shiver of wind, Liam Dagda's blood dripping down a flagpole. Anger flared. Wind answered. It surged from his chest and up his arm, swirling around his fingers in a tight little vortex. Dust spiraled, dry leaves lifting into a brief dance. Instructor's brows flicked up. Better. There's strength under all that resentment. The other recruits snickered. But tell me, Darin of North Valley, she went on, softer. When you wield this, when you use Nexu in the name of your country, do you know what you serve? He hesitated. Flagler Coast, he said finally. Do you? Her eyes held his for a heartbeat. Then she stepped back. Again. He lay awake that night, listening to the snores and low murmurs of the barracks, the faint creak of the building settling. Outside, the sea wind rattled shutters. The Kolap banner atop the citadel flapped audibly in the restless gusts. What do you serve? The answer should have been simple. King, country, comrades. But all he could see, when he closed his eyes, was his father, standing alone in the dead field, and Liam Dagda's severed head, watching over a city that no longer belonged to itself. Around him, men deserted. It started with whispers. Someone's cousin in the 2nd Legion had slipped away during a night patrol, vanished into the hills. A squad sent to guard a grain caravan never returned. A patrol assigned to the eastern road came back light by 2 soldiers who had fallen behind. Pirates pay better than the Empire now, Talon said one afternoon, watching a troop transport limp into harbor with torn sails. Out there, at least you know what you're dying for. And what's that? Darin asked. Talon's mouth twisted. Your own belly. By the year 70 PC, rumors said, agricultural taxes made up 85% of the imperial coffers. The military, ironically, saw less and less of it. Coin flowed up, not out. Armor went unrepaired, barracks unmaintained, paydays irregular. You thinking of running? Talon asked one night as they shared a stale heel of bread. Darin thought of his father, of the promise he'd made. No, he said. And then, quieter. Not yet. Then hope you like fighting with holes in your boots, Talon muttered. The Empire's might, once its pride, was rotting from the inside. Darin could feel it, like a ship whose timbers had been quietly gnawed hollow by worms. From the outside, all was banners and ceremony. Inside, it was splinters and decay, and somewhere beyond the barracks walls, pirates gathered like storm clouds, ex-soldiers who had chosen vengeance over obedience. He wondered, sometimes, which side of that line he'd eventually fall on. Sent the 3rd platoon into the streets when House Kolap came to collect, not because he needed protection, more because a wall of spears looked better than a wall of ledgers. Darin's unit formed a grim line along the edge of the market square, shields locked, spears angled toward the sky. Rain pattered softly on their helmets, running down their faces in thin, salty rivulets. The smell of wet stone and anxiety filled the air. The square, once a riot of colors and noise, was subdued. Stalls stood half-stocked, baskets of fish covered in cloth, bolts of cloth tightly wrapped and hidden beneath tables. People clustered in tight groups, voices low. At the far end of the square, beneath an awning strung between 2 carved pillars, House Kolap stood beside a tall slate table. He was younger than Darin had imagined, maybe mid-30s, with sharp, hawk-like features and dark hair pulled back from his face. He wore a long coat, embroidered with red spirals, the fabric finer than anything in the crowd. On the back of his right hand glimmered a faint sigil, the barest hint of Nexu. He held a ledger like a weapon, pages bristling with ink. "Citizens of Flag Harbor," he called, his voice surprisingly smooth, carrying easily over the murmur of the crowd. "This is not a punishment." Talon snorted softly beside Darin. "This is the price of greatness," Jakari continued. "The price of your city's safety, of your walls, of your fleet." Darin thought of the cracked barracks and rusted armor. One by one, merchants and craftsmen stepped forward to the slate table, their names read aloud by clerks with sharpened quills. Coins clinked as they emptied purses. Sacks of grain changed hands. In some cases, a hastily signed bond ceded a portion of future profits in lieu of present payment, all of it recorded, all of it taxed. "Notice," Jakari said at one point, pausing to hold up a stained sheet of parchment, "the regulation on cooking oil. No reuse of purchased oil. It is a matter of public health as well as fair trade." A ripple of anger moved through the crowd. Darin, who had eaten food fried in reused oil his entire life, felt heat rise in his chest. "What kind of law is that?" an older woman hissed under her breath. "He wants to be in my kitchen now?" "Quiet," her daughter muttered, gripping her arm. "Do you want to disappear like the rest?" The law itself wasn't what enraged them. It was what it implied, that the Kolap dynasty claimed the right, not only to tax their coin and labor, but to reach into their homes, into the smallest scraps of their private lives, and dictate how they lived. Jakari's gaze swept the square. Darin felt it pass over the line of soldiers, linger for a heartbeat on him. For a terrifying second, Darin thought the man could see the anger roiling in his chest, the Nexu prickling like static under his skin. Then, Jakari looked away. "Your sacrifices are not unnoticed," the ruler said. "Each drachma, each grain of wheat you give builds a stronger Flag Harbor. Together, we stand unbroken." Darin heard the lie, clear as a bell. Later, when the rain had thickened, and the square had emptied of everyone, except the last stragglers and the soldiers on cleanup duty, Darin and Talon stood beneath an overhang, helmets in hand. "You served under Dagda," Darin said. Talon grunted. Briefly. "What was he like?" "Not a saint," Talon said. "Not a demon either. He knew when to squeeze and when to let people breathe." He glanced at the slate table where clerks still sorted coins. "These people haven't breathed in years." Darin watched a thin boy carry a basket of coins so heavy he staggered. "Where does it all go? Walls, fleets, palaces." Talon's jaw tightened, and into the pockets of scribes who invent laws about cooking oil. Darin's Nexu flared again, a gust tugging at the edge of the awning. Talon eyed him. "You feel it more often, don't you? Since you got
Darin
here," nodded reluctantly. "Anger sharpens magic," Talon said quietly. "But it also blinds. Be careful which it does." That night, Darin left the barracks against orders. The harbor district's alleyways were a maze of wet stone and dripping eaves. Lanterns cast small puddles of light on the slick ground, leaving deep shadows between. He pulled his hood low and moved quickly, keeping to the darker paths. Rumors had reached the barracks, whispers of meetings in cellars, of people who no longer grumbled only in private, but planned. The words Kolap and traitor had begun to appear together in ways they hadn't a few years before. Darin followed those whispers to a nondescript warehouse near the fish market, its doors barred, its windows dark. Two men lounged by the side entrance, pretending to smoke. Darin approached, heart hammering. "I'm looking for work," he said. One of them flicked ash into the puddles. "Dock works down the road." "Not that kind," Darin said carefully. "The kind that doesn't pay in drachma, but in change." For a moment, he thought he'd said too much. And the man's eyes sharpened. "Who sent you?" "No one," Darin admitted. "I hear things in the barracks. I see what Jakari's doing. He hesitated, then lifted his hand. Wind flowed around his fingers in a faint swirl. "I thought you might need someone who can do more than swing a spear." The man's brows rose. "Well now," he said, pushing off the wall. Maybe you should come inside after all, soldier. The interior of the warehouse was lit by carefully shielded lanterns. Barrels and crates formed makeshift tables. A dozen people clustered in small groups, dockhands, merchants, a scribe with ink-stained fingers, a baker still dusted with flour. No one wore uniforms, yet they stood with the straight-backed alertness of those who had something to lose. At the center, a woman with braids threaded back from her face stood over a rough map of Flag Harbor drawn onto a tarpaulin. Lines marked patrol routes and tax collection times. She looked up as Darin approached. Fresh blood? From the third, the man who'd brought him in said, "Says he wants change. Says he has Nexu." Her gaze flicked to his hand. "Name? Darin." "Can you keep it shut, Darin?" Her voice was low but hard. "Can you march with bastards you hate and not let it show? Can you follow orders you despise until it's time to break them?" "Yes," he said, surprised at how certain he was. She studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded and held out a hand. "Welcome to the people the Kolaps forgot were watching," she said. "We don't have a name yet, but we will." Her palm was calloused when he took it, warm. For the first time since he'd watched Liam Dagda's head turn slowly on a flagpole in the morning wind, Darin felt something like hope. Dangerous, but real. The first time Darin saw Coast, he thought the city had been built out of coin. Light flashed off white stone and glass, off the polished scales of ships in harbor, off silver trays carried through open tavern doors. Even the cobbles seemed to gleam. Sunlight spilled over everything, harsh and bright after the dim, damp barracks of Flag Harbor. "Welcome to the other darling of Flagler Coast," Talon said dryly, as they marched in column toward the inner district. Turtle Bay is the heart. Coast is the purse. They'd been redeployed, the third split and scattered along the coast to reinforce tax routes and protect vital economic arteries. It meant long marches, longer patrols, and more time standing around watching other people pay for the Empire's mistakes. It also meant, Darin suspected, keeping soldiers like him away from their home cities long enough to prevent organized revolt. Coast smelled different from Flag Harbor, less rot, more perfume and baked bread, spiced tea and roasted nuts. Flags in a dozen colors fluttered from balconies. Traders shouted in 4 languages at once. The sound pressed in on Darin like a tangible thing, snapped Centurion Maros. "You're not here to gawk." They halted in front of a broad marble building whose colonnade cast long shadows over the square. The facade bore the carved sigil of the Nexu Council alongside the emblem of Flagler Coast. Above the massive double doors, the newer symbol of power loomed, the red spiral of House Kolap, carved in relief. "This used to be the conscription hall," Talon murmured out the side of his mouth. "Back before
What
the
is it
drachma,"
now?
Darin asked. "Where they count how little you own," Talon said. "The tax chamber." Inside, the echo of boots on polished stone sounded wrong, too clean. The hall's high ceiling was painted with scenes of Coast's early history. Fisherfolk carrying nets. Instead of coins, masons hauling stone, blacksmiths hammering blades. No money changed hands in those paintings, only goods, sweat, and effort. Beneath the painted ceiling, real life was far more complicated. Lines of citizens snaked between wooden barriers toward a row of desks, each manned by a clerk with ink-stained fingers. Tablets of pale stone behind them were etched with neat columns of numbers, rates, percentages, exemptions. Air hummed with quiet arguments. "When I was a boy," Talon muttered, "my uncle paid his tithe to Coast with fish, brought his whole catch to the city once a week, gave up a portion, went back lighter. Simple. Brutal, but simple." "You prefer that?" Darin asked. "I preferred knowing the rules," Talon said. Then the Nexu Council sent its white robes. He jerked his chin toward a side balcony, where 2 figures in pale gray stood watching, the Council's neutral sigil on their chests. Said the system was inefficient, ripe for abuse. Forced the city to move to coin. Drachma, they called it. Darin glanced at one of the posted notices. A stamped coin was etched in ink beside dense text. "In 66 PC," Talon went on, "they say everything changed. No more sacks of grain as tax, no more forced labor on the walls. Pay in money, trade more, grow richer. That was the dream. And did it work?" Darin asked. Talon spread his hands. "Depends who you ask." A commotion near the front drew their attention. People were gathering around one of the side desks, not in neat line, but in a tight knot. Voices rose. The crack of a staff on the floor tried to restore order, and failed. "Third squad, with me," Maros barked. They pushed through the crowd, shields forming a wedge. Darin felt the press of bodies, the rush of hot breath, the sharp tang of fear. At the center of the knot, a woman stood on a raised stone platform, hands outstretched. She was dressed simply, in a dark blue gown with red embroidery at the sleeves. Her hair, streaked silver at the temples, had been braided back and pinned. A small Kolap crest hung at her throat, not ostentatious, simply present. But the way people looked at her, as if she were a torch in a dark house, told Darin she did not need jewels to command. "I'm not asking you to give more out of fear," she was saying, her voice carried with the ease of someone who had spoken to crowds before. "I am asking you to give more because this city made you rich, because you walk streets your grandparents never dreamed of, because you sleep behind walls paid for by your neighbor's labor. Candace Kolap." Darin knew her name from whispered barracks tales and bitter tavern arguments. Sister to Jakari and Cade, architect of the new tax code in Coast. Some called her visionary. Others used harsher words. Smaller than he'd imagined. But her eyes, they were bright, clear, and absolutely convinced. "The drachma is not your enemy," she said, sweeping the crowd with her gaze. "It is your voice, your power. With coin we build roads, we fund healers, we pay for Nexu wards that keep your children safe. The more you earn, the more you can give back. Easy to say when you own half the docks," someone muttered. Candace heard. Her gaze snapped to a burly man near the front, his arms roped with muscle, his clothes clean but patched. She said, pointing, "What do you do?" He stiffened. "I build ships, my lady." "And do you profit?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. It wasn't a question people of his station were used to answering in front of nobles, much less Kolaps. He swallowed. Would you build them if there were no ships coming, no merchants trading, no docks?" She pressed. "Well, no." "Then you benefit from this system," she said, "just as I do. Just as the council does. Just as the poorest fishwife in the slums does when trade flourishes and food prices fall." Her voice softened. "So tell me, why should you not pay more than she does?" Somewhere behind Darin, someone clapped. Another joined. A small cluster near the platform cheered. Others remained stony-faced. Darin's jaw clenched. He could taste the logic in her words, bitter as medicine. In theory, it made sense. The wealthy should shoulder more. Those who profited most should give more back. But theory did not plow fields or feed families. He thought of his father's last acre, of the farmhouses along the valley road standing empty. "What about the loopholes?" a woman near the back called, voice sharp. "What about the men who hide their coin in foreign banks? The merchants who write their ledgers twice?" Candace flinched, just slightly. "We are working to close loopholes," she said. "No system is perfect at birth. It must be refined." "How long?" someone else shouted. "How many years until refined?" "My son went to sleep hungry last night." Swelled, the air thickening with frustration. Darin felt his Nexu respond, wind stirring at the edge of the crowd, ruffling hair and loose coat sleeves. Candace sensed it too. Her eyes flicked up, scanning the soldiers. For a heartbeat, their gazes met. There was something in her expression he hadn't expected. Not arrogance, not disdain, not for herself, for the entire edifice she'd built out of numbers and ideals, as if she could feel the city's mood, the way he felt the wind, shifting, gusting, ready to break. "Enough," Centurion Maros snapped. "Back to formation." Council representative on the balcony leaned forward and tapped the rail, signaling the end of speeches. A bell rang. Clerks raised their voices, calling names back to order. Jakari would count coin in Flag Harbor, Candace would count it here. Cade, somewhere else along the coast, would spend it on soldiers and ships. Things. As they marched out of the chamber later, Talon nudged Darin. He asked, "What do you think of the Golden Sister?" Darin thought of her eyes when she looked at him, how she'd flinched at the mention of loopholes. I think she believes what she says, he answered. Belief doesn't fill bowls, Talon said. Remember that. Darin did. He remembered it days later when he walked the street in the lower quarter and saw a line of bakers and blacksmiths outside a pawn shop, hawking tools for coin to meet tax demands. He remembered it when he watched a captain unload crates of expensive spice from a foreign ship, the tax chamber clerk counting each crate with a bored expression while the captain smiled too broadly, his silence bought by some unspoken arrangement. He remembered it when he saw the first poster go up on a wall in a crooked alley, a crude drawing of House Kolap standing atop a pile of coins, while faceless figures below her were crushed. Beneath, someone had scrawled in jagged ink, "Fair for whom?" Wind tugged at the edge of the poster. Darin kept walking, jaw tight, hand fisted at his side. By the time the riots reached the upper districts of Coast, Darin had learned the rhythm of unrest. It crept at first, like rot under fresh paint. Whispers in taverns, conversations that stopped when officers entered, black market traders growing bolder at the edges of markets. Then came the graffiti, the hurled rotten vegetables, the occasional stone thrown at a tax collector's back. After that, all it took was a spark. In Coast, the spark was bred. They raised the levy again, Talon said grimly, staring at the decree posted on the bakery wall. 2% more on imported grain. Why? Darin asked. Because the rich convinced themselves they were paying enough, Talon replied. Someone has to make up the difference. The baker, a gaunt man with flour in his hair, stood in the doorway, cheeks hollow. I can't stretch it any further, he muttered as customers crowded around him. If I charge more, they won't buy. If I don't, I can't pay the tax. What am I supposed to do? Bake air? People grumbled. Someone pushed. Another shouted. In the cramped street, frustration compressed into something sharper. When the first rock hit the tax chamber window, it was almost a relief. Shields up, Maros roared as the crowd surged. Darin moved on instinct, his shield locked with the next man's, forming a line between the tax building and the mob. Shouts battered against the wall of metal and flesh. Another stone struck his shield and glanced off. Go home, an officer shouted. Lower our taxes, someone screamed back. Stop bleeding us dry. Darin's Nexu thrummed in his chest, matching the crowd's fury. Wind gusted down the street, rattling shutters and flapping the decree nailed above the bakery. Soldier, Talon warned under his breath. We are here to hold a line, not to push. But the line was already trembling. On the steps of the tax chamber, House Kolap appeared, flanked by city guards. She didn't raise her hands for silence. Her presence did that. The noise dropped to an angry murmur. I hear you, she began. No, you don't, a woman shouted, voice ragged. You have no idea what it is to choose between paying your levy and feeding your children. I know you suffer, Candace said, and there was no false smoothness in her tone now, only strain. I know the burden has fallen unfairly on many. This is not what I intended when I drafted. You drafted this, a man bellowed, brandishing a crumpled tax notice. You and your council. You promised the rich would pay more, and they did, for a year. Then they found ways around it, and you let them. So now we pay for their cleverness. The murmurs surged again, a wave of agreement. Darin watched Candace sway on the top step, as if each word was a physical blow. Her knuckles whitened around the scroll. Do you think I don't know that? She shouted back, suddenly fierce. Do you think I don't see the ledgers? I have fought the council, fought my own brothers to push these laws through. I have argued until my voice bled that those who hoard wealth must be forced to share it. Every time we close a loophole, another opens. Every time we raise their burdens, they twist the numbers, hide their gains. This, she gestured at the crowd, at the hollow-eyed baker, at the posted decrees. This is not the justice I wanted. Then fix it, the baker yelled, or stop pretending you're not the one holding the knife. The crowd roared. Darin's grip on his spear tightened. He could feel the moment tipping. All it would take was one shove, one nervous soldier, one panicked merchant. Hold the line, Maros wheezed, sweat trickling down his temple. No advance. No strike. You hear me? What happens when they break us? Someone in the back rank muttered. Then we find out whether we serve the city or the Kolaps, another answered grimly. A bottle arced over the crowd. It shattered at Darin's feet, splattering his grease with oil. A second later, a spark flew, a careless torch, a lit scrap of cloth, and the oil flared. Flames licked up, catching on, dropped straw, racing toward the wooden steps. Someone screamed and shoved. The crowd surged forward. Darin didn't think. His Nexu exploded outward, wind slamming into the fire in a hard, focused gust. The flames guttered, skidding sideways, licking only stone. For a heartbeat, everything froze. Every eye nearby turned to him. Soldiers, protesters, clerks, Candace herself. She stared down over the heads and shields, meeting his gaze again. This time, there was something new in her expression. Recognition. She'd seen him the last time, he realized. Remembered the soldier, whose anger stirred the air. Soldier, Maros hissed. Control it. He drew his power back in, chest heaving. The wind died. Candace turned back to the crowd. I cannot fix this alone, she said, voice rough. Justice is not a single law. It is thousands of choices, every day. If the rich refuse to bear their share, then yes, you suffer. And I am sorry, but burning this hall will not change that. It will only leave you with one less place to argue your case, someone muttered grudgingly. She's the one who put us here, someone else snapped. But the momentum had shifted. Without the fire at their feet, without the first crack of steel on flesh, the crowd's fury seeped away, leading out into muttered curses and bitter looks. Slowly, grumbling, they began to scatter. Later that night, Darin slipped away to the same kind of warehouse where he'd first met the Flag Harbor cell. Coast had its own networks. Scribes who falsified ledgers to protect the poor. Smugglers who moved grain without registering it. Minor nobles secretly funneling coin to relief houses. Candace is dying by inches, said the leader of this group, an older man with ink on his cuffs. Caught between the council's demands and her brother's ambition, Darin pointed out. Whatever her intentions, they break people. Yes, the scribe said. And that's why we watch. Learn. Wait for the day she makes a mistake big enough to topple her. Or which side do you think she's on? Darin asked. The man's smile was tired, her own like all the Kolaps. The difference is, her own includes whoever fits inside her idea. Darin thought of the way she'd lashed out at the crowd. Not in disdain, but in desperate defense of her vision. Maybe, he said slowly. Our idea of the city needs to be bigger than hers. The scribe's eyes sharpened. Then, perhaps, Wind Soldier, you are exactly where you're meant to be. News from the rest of Flagler Coast tribute taxes in Turtle Bay squeezed the outlying villages until farmers fled to the city slums. Flag Harbor's levies drove merchants away. The Dakin Hills saw bandit clans swell as dispossessed farmers took up blades. And in the harbor towns, where slaves worked the docks and shipyards, another kind of injustice simmered, one even older than the drachma. Darin didn't know it yet, but the next time he was redeployed, it would be back to Flag Harbor's shadowed wharves, into the heart of a different fight. Not over how much people paid, over whether they owned themselves at all. They chained the freedmen with ink first. Darin learned that in Flag Harbor's emancipation office, a squat stone building wedged between a slave market and a counting house, the irony made his teeth hurt. Stand at the door, his new sergeant ordered the day he arrived. You're here to make the hopeful think twice and the desperate behave. Inside, the air smelled of sweat and old parchment. A line of men and women pressed shoulder to shoulder, waiting for the chance to turn their hard-earned coin into fragile freedom. Some wore collars with broken seals. Others bore raw scars at wrists and ankles. They all held coin pouches like lifelines. At the front, a clerk sat behind a desk, buried in documents. Beside him, a heavy ledger lay open, a monument of cramped handwriting. On the wall behind, a framed decree displayed the rules in tidy script. Darin read them during a lull. Any enslaved person may, upon payment of the assessed sum, purchase their freedom. Said person must then pay the emancipation tax. set at 1/3 the purchase value, in order for their liberty to be recorded and recognized by the country. Let me guess, he muttered. Can't be truly free till you pay one more tax. Weary. You'd be amazed how many reach the first sum and break on the second. A woman stepped forward, placing a small worn pouch on the desk. That's all. Her hands shook, she said. 7 years' worth. The clerk opened the pouch and counted, lips moving silently. Darin watched the tension in her shoulders ratchet tighter with each coin purchase flipped. Price, the clerk said finally. 40 drachma. The woman sagged in relief. Then However, he went on, reaching for another ledger, there is still the emancipation tax. I know. I've been saving for that too. Good. He slid a second parchment toward her. On it, an amount was written in neat script. She stared. This is more than we agreed. The tax schedule has changed, the clerk said. Rates are revised annually. But her voice broke. I can't pay this. Not all at once. I'm afraid your freedom cannot be recorded. The clerk's tone was flat, not cruel, simply tired. You may remain in service to your mistress until such time as you. Or, Darin heard himself ask. The clerk gave him a quick, annoyed look. Or you can enter into a debt contract. Pay what you can, now. Owe the rest as bonded labor to the state. Back to chains, the woman whispered. Paper chains, the clerk corrected, as if that made it better. Darin's Nexu stirred. Wind hissed faintly under the door, rattling the shelves. The woman lifted her chin. I'll take the contract, she said, voice shaking. If I walk out of here with anything, I want it to be mine. So she signed. Her name, Nay, looked small on the page beneath the dense legal script. Darin caught only a few phrases: binding until debt is repaid, labor to be assigned at the council's discretion, violation punishable by re-enslavement. This is justice, he muttered later in the barracks, Talon said. Justice is what the pamphlets call it, so they can sleep at night. The old sergeant spat into the fire. The emancipation tax is the cruelest of the lot. You sweat blood to buy yourself, then pay the state for the privilege of being human. Why does the council allow it? Darin demanded. They forced the drachma. Why not force this out? They tried, Talon said. Years ago. Kolap's fought back, said the state had to recoup its losses. Slavers threatened to stop selling manumissions at all. His mouth twisted. Council blinked. Outside, the slave market hummed. Chains clinked as merchants paraded their stock. Buyers inspected teeth, muscles, scars. Sea wind carried the smell of salt. Then, in 72 PC, everything changed. On paper, at least. It happened overnight. One morning, Darin arrived at the Emancipation office to find a crowd already gathered, not in the usual resigned line, but in a restless, buzzing knot. The clerk stood outside for once, eyes wide, a parchment shaking in his hands. What's going on? Read it yourself, Darin asked, the man said, thrusting the decree at him. The wax seal at the bottom was fresh, bearing the spiral of House Kolap and the tree of Flagler Coast. Above, in clear, bold script, by decree of House Kolap, regent of Flagler Coast, the emancipation tax is abolished, effective immediately. No additional levy shall be imposed upon any enslaved person purchasing their freedom. The state recognizes all such manumissions as complete and binding upon presentation of proof of purchase. No tax? Darin breathed. None, the clerk said. He sounded dazed. They can walk out of here, free. As if on cue, a man shoved through the crowd, clutching a wooden lockbox. His clothes were worn, his hands calloused. A faded brand scar marred one forearm. He slammed the box on the desk. This is it, he said hoarsely. Every coin I have, every coin my wife has, every coin our friends scraped together. No tax now, right? No extra. The clerk opened the box, counted quickly, nodded. Manumission price met. You're free. The man's shoulders sagged. Tears cut tracks through the grime on his face. Say it again, he whispered. You're free, The word spread faster than any order Darin had ever heard. "Free!" someone shouted outside. "No tax!" Cheers erupted. Men and women who had spent years in chains pushed toward the office, shoving coins forward as if afraid the decree would vanish by midday. Some laughed, some sobbed. A few simply stood there, stunned, as if the weight on their shoulders was too ingrained to shrug off in a single breath. Darin watched a woman he recognized, nay, from weeks before, step forward with her half-paid contract in hand. "The new law," she said quietly, voice shaking. Does it
The
erase
clerk
this?"
hesitated.
"It supersedes it. The state cannot hold you if your purchase price is paid." He swallowed. "You're free, nay?" She stared at him, then at Darin, then at the door. "Just like that?" she asked. "Nothing about this is just," Darin said softly. "But yes, like that." Outside, someone had started a song, off-key but loud. The words were clumsy and raw, a chant more than a melody. No more tax on freedom. No more chains of ink. For the rest of the day, Darin's post at the door felt different. People passed him not with hollow eyes, but with faces lit from within. Shock, joy, terror at the unknown all tangled together. "It's something," Tellin said that night as they sat on the barracks steps, listening to distant singing drift up from the harbor. "Not enough, but something." "They abolished the worst of it," Darin said. "That has to mean—" "It means House Kolap can read the city as well as we can," Tellin cut in. "He knows you can't keep a lid on a boiling pot forever, so he lets a little steam out." Darin frowned. "You think this is just calculation?" "I think if he cared about freedom," Tellin said, "he'd abolish slavery itself, not just the extra toll on the way out." He sighed. "But yes, it's a mercy. Doesn't mean it's enough." Days passed. The celebrations softened into quieter gratitude. The slave market still operated, though now with slightly more nervous merchants. The Emancipation Office continued to process manumissions, the line still long, and in the shadows, the networks Darin belonged to, no-name groups in warehouses and back rooms, more
adjusted their
freedmen means
maps.
more people who owe nothing to the old masters, the Mercoast scribe said when Darin met him again. "Nothing but anger." "Anger can burn in both directions," Darin replied. "Some will want peace, a quiet life. Some," the scribe agreed. "Others will want to tear down the system that kept them in chains so long. Those are the ones you'll see again." He was right. A year later, Darin recognized Nea in dockside cellar, her hair tied back, hands steady as she slid blades into a crate marked salt herring. "For the pirates?" he asked. "Or whoever hits Kolap ships hardest," she said. "Call them what you like." Darin didn't stop her. He helped. The fall of Flagler Coast didn't come as a thunderclap. It came as rot, spreading quietly below decks. The first sign was the uniforms. "What are we supposed to fight with?" grumbled a young recruit as he tugged at his fraying sleeve. "Hope?" "Careful," Tellin said. "They might tax that next." By then, the failure to pay the military on time was a joke told in every barracks from Mercoast to Turtle Bay. Men marked the days between promised wages on their bunks. After the third missed payday in a row, someone scratched a new motto into the mess hall table, hunger, and maybe back pay. No one laughed. Desertions increased. At first, the officers hunted the absconders, sending patrols into hills and along the coast. Then they simply didn't have enough men to spare. A kid barely 20 asked Darin one rain-soaked evening. Darin stared at the Kolap crest on the barracks wall. "We're being paid," he said, "just not in what we can spend." "In what then?" the kid pressed. "In instability," Tellin muttered from his bunk. "In the promise that when it all falls apart, someone will remember what we did and how much we hated it." The second sign was flying imperial colors. At first, it was small things, coastal traders painting over the official Flagler Coast emblem, claiming they were independent charters to avoid certain tariffs. Then came rumors of entire naval crews mutinying, sailing their vessels to hidden coves, hoisting new flags. Pirates, the city papers called them, traitors, scourge of the coast. Darin saw them up close the first time when his unit was assigned to escort a grain convoy along a stretch of cliffs. The wagons hugged the narrow road while legionnaires marched alongside, nerves taut. The attack came at dusk. A signal flare shot up from the cliffs, a burst of orange against the darkening sky. Moments later, shapes moved on the plateau above. Ropes dropped, hooks hit wood, and men in mismatched armor slid down with practiced ease. Formation, Moros bellowed. Shields. Darin's shield met steel with a jarring clang. The attacker on the other side grunted, recovering quickly, spinning his sword in tight arcs. Fall back, pretty boy, the pirate snarled. You're defending thieves' gold. You're stealing it, Darin shot back, parrying. From whom? The man's grin was wide and feral. From the Kolaps who never paid us? From the nobles who raised your taxes and then left you to rot on half rations? He feinted left, then brought his blade down hard on Darin's shield. Newsflash, soldier boy, we used to wear your colors. Up close, under the grime and stubble, Darin could see the ghost of a crest on the man's breastplate, scraped nearly clean. A legion emblem. The battle was vicious but brief. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered on the cliffside, Moros gave the only order that made sense. Protect the farmers, he roared. Let the grain go. The pirates didn't hesitate. They took the wagons, not the people. A few legion soldiers fell. A few pirates did too. But when the smoke cleared, the grain was gone, the road littered with broken wheels, and the farmers sat stunned on the cliff edge. The pirate captain called as his men hauled the last sacks away, for the wages they never gave you. Darin watched him go. The man moved with the easy coordination of someone who drilled in formation for years. Do you think they're wrong? He asked Talon quietly. About the Kolaps cheating us? Talon wiped blood from his cheek. No. About turning on everyone else instead of just them? Is there a difference? Yes, the young recruit muttered. If the whole system's rotten? There always is, Talon said. Remember that when you pick your enemies. The third sign of collapse was the trial. Word reached even the furthest outposts. Candace, Jakari, and Cade Kolap had been arrested. The government, such as it was, planned to make an example of them. They finally decided someone has to pay, the Coast scribe said, when Darin met him in a half-abandoned tavern. So they picked the ones whose names are on the most decrees. That's your leaders, Nay said, seated beside a crate of smuggled documents. Our masters, our tax lords, our warbringers. Going to string them up fixes this? It won't fix anything, Darin said, but it might break the right piece. The scribe slid a folded map across the table. The trial will be in Turtle Bay, he said, May 12th. They'll make a spectacle of it. Foreign emissaries, council observers, half the city in the square. The same square, Darin murmured, stomach twisting, where they put Dagda's head. Exactly, the scribe said softly. History loves a circle. Nay leaned forward. Then we don't go to watch, she said. We go to use it. Darin unfolded the map. Lines marked access tunnels beneath the square, old drainage channels, forgotten smugglers' routes. Circles indicated guard posts, barracks, choke points. We can't stop the trial, the scribe said, not without causing a bloodbath that will drown the people we claim to fight for. But
How?
We can use the chaos, the young recruit asked. We know where the prison wagons will be, Nay said, where they'll hold other political prisoners, not Kolaps. We know where the tax records are kept, the ones that name every debtor, every small farmer still being squeezed. We strike there, free who we can, burn what needs burning. And the pirates? Darin asked. The scribe smiled thinly, already spoken to one of their captains. He'll hit the harbor the same day, draw troops away. For his own reasons, of course. But our goals align. For now, Darin echoed. He stared down at the map, at the red circles and dark lines. He could almost feel the city in his bones, the square where he'd watched a leader die, the tax chamber, the emancipation office, the slave markets, the barracks where tired soldiers dreamed of deserts and ships. We can't just be against something, he said slowly. Then decide what that is. For something, Nay said. Before someone else decides for you. Darin closed his eyes. When he opened them, the wind inside him was no longer a restless tug. It was a direction. May 12th, 84. PC dawned bright and pitiless. The sea was calm for once, its surface a sheet of hammered silver stretching to the horizon. Seabirds wheeled and screamed over the harbor. The city stirred early. No one wanted to miss the show. Stay close, Talon murmured as they moved with the crowd. If the soldiers spot us, we're done. They wore no uniforms. Darin had left his Celtic cuirass folded on his bunk, staring at the crack in the shoulder one last time before closing the door. Over his shirt, he wore a plain brown coat. A knife was hidden at his belt, another in his boot. His Nexu would have to do the rest. The square looked as it had the day Dagda died. The flagpole still rose from the center, though the Kolap banner that had replaced the Dagda flag 10 years earlier now hung limp, its edges frayed. Platforms had been erected on the east side, facing the sea. 3 wooden scaffolds rose like skeletal fingers, ropes dangling. On a raised dais opposite the gallows, magistrates sat in solemn rows. Representatives from the Nexu Council occupied a smaller platform nearby, gray robes pristine. Foreign observers clustered under shaded awnings, fans fluttering. Between them, a single ornate chair sat empty. For the regent, the scribe at Darin's side said softly. They wanted him to watch. Cade won't sit, Nay muttered. He'll stand. Or he thinks he will. They had spent weeks preparing. The prison wagons carrying lesser political prisoners would leave the courthouse at Third Bell, pass through the North Quarter, and pause briefly by the old granary before proceeding to the holding pens behind the square. A small group, Nay and 3 others, would hit that convoy, free who they could, and vanish into the alleys. Darin and Talon had a different target, the Treasury Annex and its records. Years of debts, lists of those marked as traitors for questioning taxes, ledgers naming suspected agitators. Fire destroys paper, Nay had said. Wind feeds fire, doesn't it? It also spreads it. Then keep it where you want it, pointed out. She replied. You said your nexus is manipulation. Prove it. And above all that, like a storm cloud waiting to burst, the Kolap siblings appeared at mid-morning. Candace came first. She wore a plain gray dress, hands bound in front of her. Her hair, once neatly braided, hung loose around her shoulders. She walked with her head high. Shouts greeted her, some jeering, some cheering. Traitor, one voice cried. Visionary, shouted another. Rocks didn't fly, but curses did, thrown in both directions. Darin watched her mount the platform. She did not look toward the tax chamber this time, or toward the Nexu Council. Her gaze scanned the crowd as if searching for something else. Jakari followed. He looked thinner, tired, but the same iron rod posture held. He wore the remnants of a formal coat, the Kolap crest torn away, leaving a ragged patch. He did not acknowledge the crowd. The noise for him was less divided. Bloodsucker, someone yelled. Leech, finally, Kaid. He emerged, flanked by heavy guards, his chains thicker, his ankles shackled. He was broader than his siblings, fae blood obvious in the faint shimmer around his eyes and the almost too fluid way he moved. Scars crisscrossed his arms, old Nexu burns, whip marks, knife lines. Darin had expected arrogance. Instead, he saw something like contempt. For the magistrates, for the council, not for what he'd done, for the crowd. For the fact that they thought they could judge him. The court convenes, the chief magistrate intoned. The charges were read. Mismanagement, corruption, excessive taxation, abuse of Nexu authority. In cases tied to Cade, there were additional counts, mass executions, unlawful military campaigns, orders that led to the slaughter of civilians and the enslavement of prisoners of war. People murmured. Some wept when specific villages were named. Evidence followed, scrolls, witnesses, financial records. Darin heard enough to know that, for once, the accusations were not mere theater. The Kolaps had bled their own country dry, and yet, Talon muttered under his breath, the verdict was a foregone conclusion. Candace Kolap, the magistrate said, voice heavy. This court finds you guilty. You are sentenced to death by hanging. She closed her eyes briefly, then nodded, as if she'd already sentenced herself long ago, watching her ideals twist into instruments of suffering. Jakari Kolap, guilty, death by hanging. His jaw clenched. He said nothing. Kaid Kolap. The crowd held its breath. Even the gulls seemed to quiet. For your crimes against the people of Flagler Coast, this court sentences you to silence by dismemberment. Gasps, shouts. A woman screamed, someone retched. Even hardened soldiers flinched. That's not justice. Nay hissed. That's fear, Talon said. That's spectacle. They want to show the world what happens if you lead an empire into ruin. Chaos rippled through the square. Some cried that the punishment was finally fitting. Others cursed the government for hypocrisy, for waiting until the country was already collapsing before turning on its own. Darin barely heard them. He was watching. Kate, the fae-blooded man, had gone very still. For the first time, real fear flickered across his features, quickly masked by fury. He yanked at his chains, Nexu flaring around him in red ripples. Guards staggered back. The council representatives stood as one, hands lifted, chakras glowing faintly in their robes. A pressure hit the square, like a sudden drop in air. Contain him, one of the sages snapped. Light flared, wards activating, invisible binds snapping into place. Kaid strained against them, teeth bared, muscles shaking. For a moment, Darin saw what Flagler Coast's enemies must have seen on battlefields. This man wielding power like a blade, fire, entangled. Then the wards tightened. Now, he sagged, the scribe whispered, panting. The wagons, the records. Darin forced his feet to move. It felt wrong to turn away from the gallows, but the plan depended on timing, joining others in plain clothes. As the first noose was fitted around Candace's neck, Darin ducked into the shadow of the treasury annex. Ready? Nay murmured, already crouched by the side door with a satchel of oil flasks. Darin nodded. His heart pounded in his throat. The door was barred from the inside, but old buildings had old weaknesses. Nay found one, a cracked lintel, half-rotted in the salt air. A few well-placed blows from a stolen battering ram, a surge of Nexu wind to push, and the frame splintered. They were inside before the nearest guards realized the shout in the square wasn't about the execution. Shelves of ledgers rose in dim rows, the air thick with the smell of dust and ink. Names crowded the spines. Debts, taxes, fines, lives reduced to numbers. Straight for the back, the scribe ordered, eyes gleaming behind his spectacles. Those are the oldest, the ones they've used longest to hold people. Nay smashed oil flasks against the wood, soaking the lower shelves. Someone struck flint. Darin sputtered, she said, then caught. Your turn. He stepped forward, throat tight. This wasn't the kind of fire that killed people. It would cost lives later, perhaps. Destroyed records meant chaos. Chaos meant suffering. But those records were chains too. The bonds that kept farmers on land they no longer owned, that marked freedmen as perpetual debtors, that identified troublemakers for convenient disappearance. He thought of his father. He thought of Nay's trembling hands signing a contract. He thought of Liam Dagda's head on a pole. And wind surged from his chest, channeled down his arms, wrapping the newborn flames. They leapt higher, but stayed tight, clinging to the shelf rows he pointed at, racing along them like hungry animals. Paper curled and blackened. Ink ran in glistening streaks. Names disappeared in smoke. Outside, distant cheers turned to screams as the gallows did their work. Somewhere nearer, a bell rang. An alarm this time, not ceremony. Time, Talon barked. Out the back now. They fled through the annex's rear door just as guards thundered into the main hall. Smoke billowed after them, pouring out windows, climbing the walls. In the confusion, guards racing toward fire, spectators surging as Candace's body dropped, foreign observers shouting protests or praise. Nay's team hit the prison wagons. Later, Darin would hear how she'd broken the chains with stolen keys, how exiled scribes and minor nobles had slipped away into the alleys with them, how some had stayed to fight and died in the mud. He didn't see it. He was running toward the square, lungs burning, as the Kolap banner on the central pole caught from a stray ember. and began to smolder. By the time he reached the edge of the crowd, Candace and Jakari hung still, their bodies silhouetted against the sky. The executioners were preparing Cade. The wards glowed sickly around him. Magistrates shouted. Council members argued. The foreign observers looked scandalized, but none intervened. This was internal justice, they would say later. An ugly family matter. The Kolap crest above them flickered with flame, a red spiral warping. Darin's Nexu pulsed, echoing the gusts swirling around the square. People pressed closer, eyes fixed on the gallows, on the burning banner. Something was breaking. He could feel it. In the distance, over the roofs, a column of smoke rose from the harbor. Pirates, right on time. All at once, the city was no longer watching a trial. It was watching itself come apart. Smoke made the sun a dim red coin in the sky. Pirate ships, 3 of them, flags snapping like snapped tempers, rode at anchor in Turtle Bay's harbor. Fires blazed along the lower docks where imperial warehouses had once stood. The distant boom of cannon echoed off the water and rolled up the hills. Everything had gone to pieces. Some citizens fled. Others surged toward the gallows, not to save the Kolaps, but to vent a decade of pain. Stones and scraps of debris flew. Guards slammed shields together, shoving back. Legion units, torn between orders to maintain order and protect the magistrates, hesitated. Darin Nay's voice cut through the din. He turned to see her pushing toward him through the crowd, soot streaking her face. Behind her, 3 ex-prisoners stumbled, blinking in sudden light. One clutched a thick scroll case to his chest like a newborn. You got them, Darin said, relief punching through the adrenaline. Some of them, she panted. Not all. Her gaze flicked upward to the gallows. We were too late for them. Candace's body swayed on the rope, a gray rag in the wind. Jakari hung beside her, jaw slack. Cade still stood on the platform, arms bound, as the executioner rechecked his restraints. The wards around him pulsed. The pirates hit the harbor, Talon shouted, elbowing his way over. Half the garrison's been pulled back. The rest are trying not to get killed by their own people. This is it, Darin. The moment you wanted. The Kolap line was dying in front of him. But if the Empire fell with them into pure chaos, if pirates and warlords took everything, then what had any of this been for? We take the square, Nay said. Not for them. For us. How? Darin demanded. With what? Stones and old grudges? With symbols, Talon said quietly. The same thing they used. Only ours will mean something else. He nodded toward the central flagpole. The Kolap banner caught fire in earnest now, flames eating from the bottom up. Strips of burning cloth dropped, sending sparks into the crowd. People recoiled. Get it down, Talon said, before it falls on us, before someone else uses it as an excuse to crack skulls instead of change rules. Darin swallowed. Keep the guards busy, he said. I'll handle the flag. You and who's Nexu? Nay muttered, but her eyes gleamed. Fine. We'll give them something else to look at. She darted toward the nearest line of soldiers and threw her voice, sharp as a bell. Why are you protecting them? She shouted, jabbing a finger at the magistrates. They didn't pay you either. Like dry brush starved for a spark, voices rose. The line ignited. Some soldiers flinched, others shouted back. A few lowered shields, uncertain. The first-rank commanders screamed at them to hold, but doubt had already seeped in. Darin took a breath and ran. The base of the flagpole was ringed by a low iron fence. He vaulted it, boots skidding on stone. Stop! A guard barked, lunging. Wind answered Darin before he could consciously call it. A gust slammed the man backward, not hard enough to break him, just enough to send him stumbling into his fellows. They went down in a clatter of armor and curses. Darin grabbed the rope at the pole's base and hauled. The mechanism was stiff, half rusted. It resisted, as if even the metal had grown used to the Kolap banner's presence. He gritted his teeth, channels of Nexu flaring along his arms. Air swirled, pushing the pulley, fighting the friction. Slowly, agonizingly, the burning flag began to descend. People saw. Look, someone shouted. They're taking it down. The shout changed flavor, from anger to something else, raw, wild, disbelieving hope. More hands grabbed the rope. A dockworker, a scribe, a freed woman with old scarred wrists. Together, straining, they dragged the banner down until the charred cloth lay crumpled at the pole's base, still smoldering. For a moment, no flag flew over Turtle Bay. No Liam Kolap spiral. No Liam Dagda blue. Nothing but open sky. The silence that followed was different from the one that had gripped the city 10 years ago. This wasn't fear. It was possibility. What now? Someone gasped. Darin's lungs burned. His arms shook. The Nexu in him roared, wind spiraling around the pole. He thought of formulas, hair and hats, of theories about governance and trade and fairness, of Candace's ideals and how they'd twisted, of Jakari's meticulous ledgers, of Cade's brutal enforcement, of the council's decrees and the pirates' vengeance. He thought of his father in the dying field saying, "Send hope." Now, Darin panted, we raise something of our own. From somewhere in the crowd, a bolt of cloth appeared, passed from hand to hand. Blue, torn from an old Dagda banner someone had kept hidden. Another piece, darker, patched in. Someone else produced a strip of white sailcloth, ragged at the edges. A woman swiftly knotted them together, fingers deft and sure. Blue for the old blood, white for what could be new. Up you go, wind soldier, Nay said, nodding toward the knot of cloth. You started this. I didn't when you didn't look away, she said. Now, move, before someone with worse ideas gets there first. He tied the cloth to the rope with fingers that trembled more from emotion than effort, then stepped back. Help me, he whispered, half to the people, half to the wind. Hands closed on the rope, dozens, then hundreds. Together, grunting, they hauled. The makeshift flag rose. At the gallows, the executioners paused in their preparations for Kaid. The magistrates turned. Even the council representatives looked up, eyes narrowing. The blue and white patchwork banner reached the top of the pole and caught the wind. It snapped out, jerked once, then flew. A cheer tore itself from the crowd like a storm breaking. It wasn't neat. It wasn't unanimous. There were still those who shouted curses, who clung to old loyalties or old fears. There were still soldiers who tried to restore order with raised spears. But something had shifted. That's not the Dagda crest, Talon noted softly at Darin's shoulder, voice barely audible over the roar. No wave, no noble sigil. No, Darin said. On the cloth, crudely painted in fresh blue, a single symbol stood out. A spiral, but not Kolap red. A swirl that looked very much like a gust of wind. Whose banner is that then? Nay said simply. The day did not turn into a clean revolution. There were fights, blood spilled. In some streets, pirates took advantage of confusion to plunder. In others, they turned their blades on Kolap officers instead. Cade Kolap never lived to see the end of his sentence. Someone, not a rebel, not a magistrate, perhaps just a man whose village had burned under one of Cade's campaigns, reached him with a thrown knife before the executioners could begin. He died choking on his own blood, in his last words lost in the noise. Foreign observers retreated to their ships. The Nexu Council representatives argued among themselves, some insisting on direct intervention, others warning of backlash. In the end, they did what they always did, wrote a report. But in the neighborhoods beyond the square, in the valleys where fields had turned to dust, in the slave quarters by the harbor, the real work began. Not of collapsing, of rebuilding. Weeks later, Darin stood once more on the hill, overlooking his father's old farm. Now. The house sagged, the fence leaned drunkenly, but people moved over the land, 3 families, working together, turning old soil with new tools. They looked up as he approached. A woman wiped her brow with the back of her hand. You're Bray's boy, she said. The one who went to the military. Is he... Gone, she said gently, year before last. He held on longer than most. Stubborn, that one, she smiled. He'd be glad to know someone's planting here again. Under whose claim? Darin asked. Under our own, she said. For now. For now. The country's laws were in tatters. The council was negotiating with hastily formed city assemblies, trying to keep the entire coast from tearing itself apart. Pirates had carved out fiefdoms on some islands. On others, ex-Celtics had formed local militias, not beholden to any distant throne. In Turtle Bay, the blue and white banner still flew, not as a symbol of noble house, but as the flag of a council, dock workers, farmers, freedmen, one former tax clerk, 2 minor Nexu practitioners elected by their neighbors. They argued endlessly. Darin had refused a seat when offered. They tried. "I'm not a ruler," he'd said. "I'm someone who got lucky with the wind. But we need you," Nay had argued. "People listen to you." "Then I'll be in the streets," he'd replied, listening back. He looked over the valley now, feeling the breeze slide over his skin. Nexu stirred. He was stronger than he'd been 10 years ago. Training and necessity had honed his power. His nexus had grown clearer. Range and manipulation, the instructor had been right. He could push the wind where he needed it, feel its shifts miles away. He knew now the danger of believing that gave him the right to decide for everyone else. Flagler Coast fell because too few made too many decisions for too many, he said softly. "Who are you talking to?" the woman asked, amused. "An old ghost," he said, thinking of Liam Dagda, of Candace, of Jakari, of Kaid, of his father, of everyone whose blood, colored or red, had soaked these fields and streets. He walked back down into Turtle Bay at dusk. The square was different now. The gallows were gone, dismantled plank by plank. In their place, workers were raising a circular platform, open, low, surrounded by steps. A place for debate, for proclamations made to faces rather than to bowed heads. Children chased each other across the stones where once blood had pooled. At the base of the flagpole, someone had planted a small garden. Blue flowers. Someone had chosen them deliberately, nodded in the wind. Herbs for cooking. Bright daisies for no reason at all, except that they made the place less haunted. Darin tilted his head back. The banner above still snapped in the breeze, blue and white against the darkening sky. "What do you think?" Nay asked, appearing at his side with that uncanny ex-slave silence of hers. "I think it's ugly," he said. She laughed. "We're working on a better one." "I'm serious," he insisted. "The lines are crooked. The symbol is off-center. The blue keeps bleeding into the white every time it rains. Sounds about right for us," she said. Crooked, off-center, bleeding into each other. He huffed a laugh despite himself. "What now?" he asked quietly. "Now?" Nay shrugged. "We argue about taxes again." He groaned. "Only this time," she added, "we do it in the open, with everyone, not just in chambers with ledgers and stamps. We remember what Candace tried to do and how she failed. We remember how Jakari used the law like a blade. And we don't let anyone, ever again, and the pirates decide alone how much our lives are worth." She nodded toward the harbor, where a few ships bore flags no one had agreed on names for yet, half merchant, half privateer. "Some will become guards," she said. "Some merchants. Some will keep stealing. We'll deal with them. With courts that don't hang a man for being fae while pretending not to see the humans who whipped him on their orders." Darin's gaze drifted to the distant Nexu Council tower, its pale flame-like tip barely visible above the rooftops. "And the council?" he said. "They'll adapt," Nay said, "or they won't. Either way, Nexu existed before them. It'll exist after." Wind ruffled her hair. Not exactly the end of an empire story everyone expected, she mused. No glorious new king, no shining general, no blue-blooded savior, Darin said. She bumped his shoulder. Just a stubborn farmer's son with a temper. He looked once and a more talent at the for flag. Catching wind. It was pigment mixed in a bucket in someone's kitchen. It was cloth patched from sail and curtain. It was handprints on the pole from everyone who had helped raise it. One day, historians would give this era a name. They would write about the bleak decline and the trial and the pirates. They would argue about who was right and who was wrong, about whether Candace had been a visionary or a villain, whether Cade's sentence had been justice or horror, whether the Nexu Council should have done more. Darin suspected they would miss what mattered most. That in the heart of Flagler Coast, in a city where once a severed head had dripped gold rain onto a marketplace, Ordinary people had decided to pull down a flag and lift another. When I was a boy, my sister told me to remember that morning, the day they put Dagda up there. Nay glanced up. Do you? Every time the wind blows, he said. But now I remember this too. He nodded at the blue and white banner, snapping and curling in the sea breeze. One day people had whispered, hiding in their homes as Kolap soldiers marched past. One day, the colored blood will flow again, not as death, but as rebirth. Darin closed his eyes for a moment and listened to gulls, to children's laughter, to the distant hammering of shipwrights rebuilding, to the murmur of voices arguing on the half-finished council platform. The bleak decline had broken Flagler Coast. It had scattered her legions, emptied her coffers, tarnished her name. But in the cracks, something new had taken root. When he opened his eyes, the flag still flew, not perfect, not finished. But theirs, Darin smiled. A gust caught it, just snapping it taut, as the wind moved past his face and rushed out toward the sea, carrying with it a promise. Not of easy days, but of a coast that would never again forget who it truly belonged to. You enjoyed this deep dive into the magical biology of the Grinnmere. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. Until then, stay curious, and may your mana flow strong.